So good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to Creature Research Series, initiated by Transcultural Exchanges and Network Research Strand of Creature, Multicultural Art Institutions at the Crossroads. It's a two-part series of panel discussions with art cultural policymakers, art practitioners and professionals, and academic researchers seeking to unpack the challenges and expectations faced by multicultural art organizations. Today's panel discussion, Pressing Challenges, is the last part of the set to unpack systematic issues within multicultural art organizations and the sectorial challenges of equality, diversity and inclusivity in recent years, which I refer them as EDI from now. It cannot be more timely to discuss EDI following the release of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities a couple of weeks ago. I'm Wesley Ling, Professor of Transcultural Arts and Design and the Director of Creature. I will be moderating the panel discussion. Before we kickstart the panel, I'd like to remind you that this session is recorded. We appreciate the audience to switch off the camera and microphone so that we can focus on the whole panel on the screen. Unfortunately, the chat box cannot display questions or comments. This is really a technical errors here. So we appreciate the audience to press the hand raising button for the questions in the Q&A towards the end of the session. We have dedicated time for the Q&A, so do prepare your questions along the way. We have a strong crew today, and we are delighted to welcome our 5 guest panelists. So I'm going to introduce them to you from alphabetical order. Terry Adams, Arts Council England's Relationship Manager for Diversity. Terry's role encompasses, promotes and delivers Arts Council agenda on EDI. A particular focus is the rollout of the inclusion and relevance investment principles of Arts Council new 10-year strategy, Let's Create. Work also includes responding to the sector's approaches and engagement on diversity policy and implementation. He has researched and consulted for national and international media providers as well as business and organisational development for established and fledgling individuals and organisations from Black, Brown, Asian and other culturally and ethnically diverse backgrounds. Our other speaker, Sebak Njiama, Artistic Director of INIFA in London, which is home to the Stuart Hall Library, a rich resource for a globalised discourse on the curatorial and artistic practice of artists and curators from Latin America, Africa, Asia, Caribbean and the diaspora. Sebak most recently served as co-curator of Chicago Architecture Biennale and is the initiator of the Under the Mango Tree, a self-organised gathering of decolonising and unlearning practices. She has also held positions at Hayward Gallery, Turner Contemporary, the International Foundation Manifesto, and Documenta 14. Dr. Susan Ashley, Associate Prof in the MA Program, Creative and Cultural Industries Management at Northumberland University. She's a cultural studies scholar interested in the democratization of public culture with a focus on Black and minority ethnic activism in culture and heritage. Dr. Ashley is currently a principal investigator for the HRC project Multicultural Organisational Archives and past leadership fellow for multicultural heritage. Her latest monograph is A Museum in Public, Revisioning Canada's Royal Ontario Museum, which was published by Routledge in 2019. And she also has an upcoming co-edited volume with Dina Stone, whose heritage challenging race and identity in Stuart Hall's postmodern Britain, to be published by Routledge until 2022. Our third speaker, Teresa Cisnero, a Chicano curandra, curator and administrator. Teresa has worked with Sorry You Feel Uncomfortable Collective and other constitute art and higher education groups. She is inclusive practice led at the Welcome Collection. In 2018, she wrote Document Zero, a publication exploring our inability to diversify the arts. Dr. Kai Sing Tang is an artist, curator, consultant, and academic. best known for using art and artful agitation to catalyze conversations for change. Kai's work stands out for its positive atmosphere, radical interdisciplinarity, eclectic style, and cheeky attitude that is positively disruptive. Very exciting here, Kai. Engagement in Images Award for Cultural Change that would describe her positively disruptive image. She is an active volunteer for around 15 initiatives, including the Neurodiversity in and Creative Research Network, which she found. Dr. Tang is a senior lecturer at Manchester School of Art. Now, without further ado, let's start our conversation. I'd like to begin by addressing the pressing challenges in each of our panelists' affiliation. Can you tell us more about your role in your affiliation or your involving projects? What pressing challenges are you or your affiliation currently facing? Can we start with Steba?
Good evening, everyone. So I currently am the artistic director at INNOVA, which is the Institute for International Visual Arts that was founded in 1994. And I think in terms of current pressing challenges, I think in the wake of the sort of Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of grassroots activity that's taken place in not only the UK but in various parts of the world, the way in which cultural organisations responded and the kind of backlash to those statements kind of shows that that I think that a small research-led organisation like INNOVA is needed still to really support artistic practice in a space which allows for practices to flourish, but not only really to think about continual production, but also to think about the importance and the rigour of research and understanding a radical practice as part of a continuum of thinking and being that sometimes is in total opposition to the way in which institutions practice. So I think that's one of, I think, the current challenges.
Right. And Teresa, how about your affiliation and where you see yourself in?
Okay, so I'm at the Wellcome Collection as Inclusive Practice Lead, and I'm part of an initiative that was started in 2018. So I came to this role previously as a curator, so I'm not necessarily part of a diversity sector. I'm not a diversity worker, so I come more as a curator, commissioner of artists, and I was for years working at INNOVA, and I've done projects with artists, but I moved much more into finding that being a curator, and this may sound odd, is not good enough anymore, that curating an object doesn't really shift or change the systems that we are actually part of. So I'm much more interested in how do you actually address systemic oppression by using policy and law and behavioral change. So going into the Wellcome Collection now, which is where I'm at, and is part of the Wellcome Trust, they started this initiative in 2018 to really think about how do you actually embed access, diversity, and inclusion. And I guess what I was asked to do was one thing, and I think I've shifted it to really think about behavioral change, because I think a lot of projects and a lot of approaches are very superficial. And I think the biggest challenge is money, because people don't have the money to be actually able to implement and create the conditions for real change. So what I'm working with I guess my biggest challenge at the Wellcome Collection is time, because I'm on a limited schedule. I'm there only to the end of the year. But what are the expectations of change? Because you actually have to, how should I say, people have to be responsible, but you can't make someone responsible for something they don't know how to do. So I think there's the biggest challenges is like, you can embed access, diversity, inclusion, and equity, but if people don't know how to embody it, then there's no point in doing it, and it just becomes a waste of money and time. So I guess my biggest challenge is that Wellcome Collection or the Wellcome Trust, we have funding, we make time, but we're just one part of an ecology of the art sector or the culture sector, and we may be moving in a certain direction or trying to, but we're not doing it with the group of people. It's almost like we're an outlier right now because of the approach we're taking, which is much more about embedding it differently. So I think this is where one of the challenges is if we're doing something, how can we ensure others are coming with us, or how do we exchange too?
Right, yeah. I mean, I'm sure that we will return to you to look at more of the practices that you've done with Welcomed, and also particularly for Teresa's domain, that you're more kind of like related to like cultural behavioral change in internal aspects rather than in the audience-facing aspects. So that would be something that we come back to you again. So, Susan, I know that you've worked with a lot of minority groups in the Northeast, and there are not necessarily art institutions, but there are more social communities as well. And you might also come across a lot of challenges that they've encountered. So I wonder whether you can share your experience as well.
So I actually was wanting to answer the question from two perspectives, because I guess I'm the academic on the panel here, and wanting to emphasize the role of universities in helping this change, you know, reflecting what Teresa was saying about how to really embody change and how to fit within the whole cultural ecology. I think universities have a huge role in doing this, especially people like myself who teach in creative and cultural industries management, and trying to convey, you know, underlying different ways of thinking of the world in some of the students that we're encountering. So, you know, I think that needs to be said at some point here, and I'm kind of the academic representing. But in terms of my research, yes, I have been constantly working with a group of partners in the Northeast. We're looking at what is the role of heritage in relation to the kinds of arts and cultural practices that they do. And the challenges encountered are many, you know, starting with funding, including things like being asked to represent with white partnerships. There's a lot of distrust of white mainstream institutions, and a really strong desire and need to network on the ground amongst these cultural organizations that I've been working with. So to that end, we're working on developing, in a very small way, a cultural archive, so that their practices, their historic practices that have been going on forever, get more visible and get out there in the public sphere in some way. So I'll stop there.
Right, thank you, Susan. And Kai, I know that you're also wearing two hats. You are academic, but at the same time you're an artist. So I wonder whether you have anything to add in your area.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me today, first of all, Wesley, and very nice to be with everyone else today. Yeah, so I wear 2 or 3 or 4 hats. So I'm an artist, I'm a practitioner. I like to describe myself as an anti-social artist, but I'm also a curator. But I also sit on a couple of boards, and my day job, where I get my income, not a lot, but a little bit, is as a senior lecturer at Manchester School of Art. So I want to just speak to a couple of things here. I really, what's the word? I can hear what has been said already in terms of how what some of the EDI issues are in terms of research that might run against the sort of institutional policy side of things, but also what Teresa has pointed out in terms of resistance to behavioral change by institutions. And to that, I just want to point out something that I've been observing is how, you know, with that with last year's year of reckoning, there has been a lot of emergency pots of funding and pots of funding that are claiming to be framed around EDI. However, the people who do get the funding are people who cannibalize those funding. They have nothing to do with EDI, and that so that's just something that I'm sure quite a few of us have observed. But the one thing that I do want to point out, wearing my academic hat and also my hat as a curator, is something about leadership. It's the absence of leadership at the top. So everything else is tokenistic and performative for me. And to speak about leadership is something that is very close to me. I'm also starting a new program that seeks to rival Claw's program. No, I didn't say that. But it seeks to create an alternative way of looking at leadership and really unpack it, decolonize it. So currently, for me, the main issue is how cultural institutions still are white run. They are still upholding normative ways of doing things. By that I mean neuronormative as well, because I'm neurodivergent. That's another side of my practice and my being disabled / neurodivergent. So white is default, neuronormativity is default. So all that is still default. And also as an artist, because as a practitioner on the panel today, I also so for me that is a big problem. And when that stays, and when you do anything else, that for me is pretty performative. So when you get artists, when you get people coming into your team that are non-white, etc., that is performative. And as an artist, I have been refusing labor to work with institutions that want to just display my body as part of as optics. So because I don't want to be scapegoated. So that's something I'm really keen to kind of just point out. And also how we see this everywhere. It's musical chairs, it's right at the top. It's always the same people going around, and no matter how many things they have done, no matter how many crimes they've committed, no matter how many wrong things they've said about fried chicken, etc., they're still up there. So that's just what I wanted to point out for now.
Right, thank you. I'm sure there were a lot of us actually echo with your point, and I can see like Teresa is knocking a lot while Kai is describing all these challenges. And before I go to Terry, I actually want Teresa to have a bit of a response to Kai's challenges to see how, can you tell us a bit more about how these actually echo in the workplace that you are in?
Sorry, is this for Terry or Teresa? For me?
Teresa, yes, Teresa.
Oh, so I was just thinking about this, how funding is working currently and how the Arts Council has put together a pot of money to potentially enfold and address these questions around how we, how as organizations, well, not welcome, but generally address this kind of really systemic racism, and how the diversity, we've been trying to diversify now for over 20 years within the arts. You know, you think about places like Innova, what they've come out of, which was in the, 90s, early 90s, 94 is when a place like Innova gets created. And you still think, like, you do the measurements of like how many directors are actually Black or Asian or brown. You probably put them in a handful, right? And you think like, how have we not, we haven't really moved much, right? And now there's a big pot of money because, of course, the anti-racism protests, COVID, it's a combination. And I keep thinking about, but how are institutions held accountable for the change by the funder? And these are the questions that I constantly have about what does it mean to be given funding, but also who is not the funding going to, but on what conditions are people delivering the funding? Because currently I have a full-time job, but I am being asked to consult with organizations on the institutional change. Really, it's about organizational development, but I also can't, I take on limited external projects, but who's going to qualify it? how do we know what the change we're looking for is? Is it about numbers? Is it about your audiences? This is where I have questions around how funding sometimes acts to ensure that the status quo stays as a status quo. And it is because majority of institutions are white managed. So I just want to say an institution is not white. An institution is white majority run. There's no such thing as a white institution, because we referred to a white institution earlier, and I have a gripe with that, especially with public institutions. So I'm going to stop there.
Right, thank you. I mean, well, that's very clear. And I know that all of you touch on funding, if not exacerbating funding. So we can't have the best person to answer these. Terry, you have to come in to talk to us. I mean, what position are the funders in all these sort of sectoral challenges? Before you actually go into promote the Let's Create from Arts Council, address some of those aspects which obviously, well, some of our panelists refers to as this sort of funding as tokenism and all the rest before, well, the grand new council Let's Create scheme. Terry, I give it to you.
So over to me. I wouldn't class myself as an expert in this, but I do know enough about this subject, I think, hopefully to provide a balanced and hopefully informative perspective. So, of course, as you know, the Arts Council of England is the non-governmental organisation who's responsible for developing art and culture in this country. We distribute the money that the government makes available and comes through a lottery funding to individual artists and arts organisations. I think it's fair to say that the issues of equality, diversity and inclusion and Let's Create strategy have now converged. I think arguably we at the Arts Council have acknowledged that the advances that we thought and hoped we had made in our previous initiatives and endeavours have not perhaps achieve the levels of change that we anticipated or indeed hoped. Nevertheless, we are where we are, and we are now in the processes of making available and releasing our new 10-year strategy, Let's Create. Key things in that strategy are that we want to see an increased involvement of individuals in creative endeavours, of communities in creative endeavours, and we're moving away from this notion of art being solely for artists and arts organisations. We believe it is a collective and a community and individual endeavour that everybody has got and should have an opportunity to be and take part in. Moreover, within the strategy, we have got a number of what we're calling investment principles. Now, these principles are going to be key to how we distribute our funding in the future. I think the one most relevant to this discussion is the principle of inclusion and relevance. The other three are ambition and quality, environmental responsibility and dynamism. But I'm going to focus this evening on the conversation on inclusion and relevance, because this is how we are framing our diversity, equality and inclusion agenda. It is going to be essential for any organisation or indeed individual who seeks funding from the Arts Council to address that principle in its entirety. There are three separate strands to that principle. The first one being programming, and that's diverse and inclusive programming. The second being workforce, and by workforce we're talking about staff, leadership and board. And the third being communities. And those three characteristics, or what we're describing them as pillars, will be central to all activity and indeed action we expect from organisations if they want to receive our funding. Now, it sounds very big and bureaucratic, and that's because we are the Arts Council, and by our nature, that is what we do. We are bureaucrats, in short, but we are bureaucrats who believe we have an understanding of what makes a good art ecology in this country. We are an organisation. I do not have an arts practice or indeed an arts background. I have a background elsewhere, but we have within our organisation people with a range of skills, levels and understanding of what good art and culture should be in this country. I mean, I could go on, but I'm really keen to answer some of the questions that I know my panel members have got to ask. But I think one of the questions I always come back on, often we hear this claim, nothing has changed. Now, I will always challenge that notion, because I think it is a bit of a catch-all phrase, and it is one that I think has been unfortunately used to propagate quite a very generally and held perception. But it is one that, if we closely look at it and examine it, we perhaps cannot strictly adhere and believe in that notion nothing has changed. It is absolutely clear, and it is absolutely the case, not enough has changed, and clearly not enough has changed quickly. But we have to sometimes, and I think it's okay, and I'm not going to stop people from saying nothing has changed, but it should, where necessary and possible, be qualified. So I'm going to stop there, and perhaps some of my colleagues on the panel might want to come back to me on some of those comments that I've just made.
Thank you, Terry. Sebak, I wonder whether you feel like there's enough change for you and for INIFA in response to Terry's comment.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on this morning. I was actually reading from a book that was put together by Maud Salter called Passion, on Black women's creativity, and in that publication, Lubaina Himid, so this is probably in 1990 when she wrote this, talks about the kind of basically the difficulty of being a radical artist or having a radical art practice, whereby the funding to support you as an artist comes through a sort of chain of events, which actually Terry has described exactly what she described. I suppose the system's slightly different. I think they had Arts Council Great Britain, and now we have Arts Council England, but you know, fundamentally that there was, you know, there's a sort of there is a big problem here in terms of the current government and the kind of rhetoric that's coming out of our current government, and how that plays into or you know, trickles into policies and the way that funding is administered through the Arts Council, and then how that funding goes through into institutions, and how those institutions then decide on you know, where that money is spent. Now, in the article that I read from Lubaina, Lubaina was kind of talking about the issue of, like, let's say notionally institutions saying, yeah, we're doing the work, but actually not only are they not doing the work, but the institution itself doesn't reflect the fact that they say they're doing the work. So even though we understand, you know, the Arts Council obviously needs to be in some ways a kind of bureaucratic organisation that keeps its sort of checks and balances, I think when it comes to the question of the accountability of institutions, it's not enough really to sort of say that, you know, institutions need to hold other institutions to account. If an artist has an issue of racial discrimination within an arts institution, who do they go to? Who do they go to? Who do they turn to? Who can actually vouch for them? And that's a really big issue, because if we are saying that, you know, we're kind of giving the responsibility to how the funding is spent by an organisation or an institution, and that institution is deemed, you know, whether the government wants to recognise it or not, are institutionally racist, how on earth is it possible to kind of create a system that really supports the artist as opposed to supporting the institution, which is what I think is, you know, a huge issue, and it's something that I think for me, I'm also trying to think outside of, you know, or unlearn all of the probably years of, you know, working in institutions and seeing the ways in which organisations sort of fund certain bits of work. When I worked in education, I saw time and time again that the work that we were doing was the thing that was kind of really couching the funding for other parts of the programme. So you know, I think there is a question about accountability here, and also support in terms of artists. So that's why I sort of say, for me, it's not really, the issue isn't really about, you know, creating anti-racist toolkits for other organisations. It's really about how can we create something that can actually support artists, and that my time is not spent, you know, bureaucratically sort of filling in all kinds of evaluations. I should be spending more time with artists, and I feel often that I'm letting them down by not being able to kind of give them the time, the energy, the resources that should be allocated to them. Yeah.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, well,
I just come in on that.
Terry.
Yeah. So I think I mean, that's an excellent point. There is, and there have been issues around accountability when it comes to issues on you know, what we previously called diversity and diversity only. We at the Arts Council have recognised that, and one of the you may know of our term, the Creative Case for Diversity. So that was an initiative that was designed to encourage, support organisations. I can see some wry smiles on the faces here. Organisations to have a much more proactive, a much more inclusive approach to diversifying their programmes and supporting their artists. It was initially launched about 9 years ago or so, and we are still aligning to that policy. But one of the things that we fundamentally recognise is that it had no teeth. So at the point when people were saying, well, okay, we need to diversify our policies, and there was activity to do that, the extent to which they did it, how successfully or otherwise, it didn't change very much, or it didn't change anything at all. And even though at the time we floated the notion that if you did not, as it were, meet your creative case contribution, there would be impact. There was never impact for anybody who did not achieve what we would have expected from them from the creative case. That will change in the future. We have a commitment within the organisation, across the organisation, that those who do not fulfil their expectations and targets, the standards around programming, and not just programming, the wider diversity, inclusion and equality agenda, will face sanctions, and those sanctions will include financial sanctions, and it may ultimately, for the worst offenders, potentially include disinvestment. We're still working out the details of that, but that is the direction of travel that we are currently going in.
Teresa, you have a point to add.
I just was going to say that I am one of those beneficiaries of the Creative Case for Diversity, for full disclosure. I actually was a change maker, and I can tell you that the organization I work for was really problematic. Like, I think it was great for them to have a brown curator. However, there was never a real intent of change. And as you said, Terry, it's great to take the money, but then, like, well, where's the real impact? And I remember it was just to sort of, it was just a thing for me of like, yeah, and this is what I think is like, what are the accountability procedures that can be put in place that are very clear? And it's not necessarily just about audiences, right? You actually have to go about how is the entire organization set up to ensure that it's equitable to everyone, that we're not just having more directors who, you know, have certain privileged backgrounds. I don't care if you're Black or brown or white. You know, if you come for money, you come for money, and you're going to have a certain positionality in the world that allows you to be a director. So it's not also good enough just to say, how many, you know, Black artists have you brought in? Because it's just then performative, right? There's no real change. So this is kind of where it's really interesting. You know, Sapak is saying, you know, you just want to be with the artist, right? You don't want to be the bureaucracy. But the fact is that our institutions are set up on forms of institutional racism, you know, and if the institutions themselves are structures, the systems by which they enact don't change, nothing's ever going to change. And I think there is something about potentially the Arts Council creating a way where they can teach organizations how to organize differently. But I know there's the hands-off approach, or supposedly a hands-off approach. So there's this kind of thing around, how can you hold someone accountable for something they don't know how to do yet?
Terry.
There is a balance to be struck, and you're absolutely right. We need, I think it's fair to say, the Arts Council does need to, as it were, step up to its responsibilities. That said, we are now moving in areas of development that previously the Arts Council did not have much experience in, but we fundamentally do recognise that if we are looking for change, and the change we're looking for is cultural. So you'll see that as we move towards, for example, our next national portfolio application stage, we will be telling organisations, we expect you to change. This is not a business as usual approach. This is a recognition that what we had hoped we had achieved in the past has now been shown not to have achieved. So we're not a radical organisation. I'm never going to go as far as saying that, but I will say that there is clear desire and intention within the organisation to bring about a shift. We have to remember what we're talking about here is publicly funded art. So we know that art and culture is broad and diverse in its nature, but we're talking about publicly funded art. And by that, we should be reflecting the public of this country. And if you look at the statistics and you look at the demographic data, you'll see it is by its nature very diverse, and that need and must be reflected in what we fund. And there will be people across the sector who are not happy with that approach, but everybody in this country pays their taxes, they contribute to this country, so therefore they have an absolute right to see the arts and culture that reflects them funded through organisations like the Arts Council and delivered by those organisations who get funding from the Arts Council.
Thank you, Terry. And I've had a look at the Let's Create scheme on the website, and it was there to drive change, but at the same time, it's a very ambitious strategy that you set out for 10 years. And from what you've also tell us about the desire to engage with the whole public, with all walks of life, to art and culture, and to make England a different place in the next 10 years. And I wonder to what extent that a small art institutions can take up this demand to meet these challenges. Are they set up enough to achieve what they're expected?
I think the achievement is twofold. So first of all, it is the organisation who sets their own vision and their own targets. It is for them to decide how they want to deliver the art and culture that they're responsible for. We, as a development organisation and publicly funded organisation, needs to ensure that what we make available in terms of our funding supports them, but also supports that wider agenda and that wider approach to ensuring that the art and culture that we fund is truly inclusive and truly diverse. Smaller organisations do often carry quite a big punch, in that when one considers that the level of funding they get, especially compared to some of the bigger, more mainstream institutions, they can often make a bigger impact across equality, diversity and inclusion than some of the big ones. So it's back to the Arts Council to say, how do we support those organisations that we believe and we can see are delivering on our strategy? What can we do to support them? Now, as you are aware, the Arts Council is an organisation that has application processes like nobody else. You know, our most simple application process is still one that will be seen as complicated for many. We will, I think it's fair to say, be simplifying the process later this year. So what I can say is that in autumn this year, there will be changes made to the project grant application process, which we believe will make it easier for applicants to apply. And by that, we are hoping that we are going to see a much broader and diverse group of applicants apply to our funding programs. Because as has been said, funding and money is key in this factor. I think we cannot get away from that. Some of us would like to believe, well, it's all about the passion, it's all about doing things for free and for nothing, but it is not. It is about ensuring that there's adequate funding throughout the sector to ensure those smaller organisations, often when there is an unfair expectation around diversity, are able to deliver on their vision and their objectives, because often their visions and objectives have at their heart and have at the core the values of equality, diversity, inclusion that we are espousing and we are expecting to see across our sector. So again, it's back to the Arts Council, and I think it has been said that it is difficult to hold institutions to account, but unfortunately that's all we have, because if we say nothing, then the chances of changing is nothing. So if you can, and my advice is to everybody, when you see things that you do not believe are right and are not inclusive and not relevant, then call them out. Call them out. It is going to be maybe not as effective and maybe not as comfortable as one might like, but if one stays silent, then we don't get to hear these things. And part of the reason the Arts Council is changing now, and we do know this, is that because in the past people have said these things, this is not good enough. People have said, no, your funding is unfair to diverse groups. People have said that there are institutions getting money for doing things they say they're doing when they're not. And it is the fact that people have said these things that have prompted some of the changes that have been put in place now. So I would say to everybody listening, when you think of what the Arts Council should be doing and needs to be doing, but it's not, whatever way possible, call it out.
Right.
Can I ask who's going to be during the actual applications, right? That would be my question. So great, you'll make it more accessible, more open, other people can apply, but who's actually judging the applications? Because that's actually fundamentally potentially where the problem is, right? Okay. So you might have a really interesting project, but if I don't hold that aesthetic or that approach, or the understanding of value, which we know because we're in the arts and arts is about aesthetics, experience, etc. And if your education is not necessarily as global or diverse, you have a more, a mono vision of what art can be. So this would be my question is like, I mean, great, accessible, easier to, but then it gets in and then who's judging? Because it's about judgment here now.
Yeah, it's a perfectly valid and it's a good question. The Arts Council is seeking and it is achieving increased levels of diversity of its staff. The only way I think we are likely to make some of those fundamental changes, you're right, it is about individuals. Ultimately, we have a framework upon which we are going to be making decisions, and we do make decisions. And I think it's fair to have a framework which everybody knows and it is open, but it is still down to individuals. What we like to think is that those individuals are working to the same values, but as the organisation increases, we have in place what we describe as our equality objectives, and that means that every open policy, every open application that we have, there is an underlying equality imperative to it and questions to be asked. So whereas once before we would have applications and they would be assessed and accepted often objectively based on criteria and eligibility and the application itself, we now will have an additional level of assessment, and that is one around equality and diversity. What that means is that, first of all, those who are making or undertaking those assessments will be looking specifically to ensure that they have addressed it from an equality and diverse perspective. And where necessary, we have now increasing numbers, maybe still not enough, increasing number of staff within the organisation who can speak to some of those specific protected characteristic sensitivities and cultural factors. So we have an increasing our staff numbers across race and ethnicity, across gender orientation, across disability. So we have people within the organisation who now increasingly can make sure that what we have is that broader assessment. There clearly was a time in the organisation where decisions were made by a particular demographic that was not as diverse and indeed inclusive as the one that we are looking for. We've recognised that is likely to have caused some of the how best to put it, well, some of the profile of organisations that we had. We have an increasing diverse portfolio of organisation. In many of our views, not enough, but we believe we're moving in the right direction. But there's still a long way to go. But you're right, it is back down to those individual assessors who are now supported with a specific policy around equality and a much more diverse staff to ensure that some of those sensitivities and issues that may have been lost in the past now do not get overlooked.
I just really want to quickly say, is Terry, I mean, it's a tough job to be here representing the Arts Council. You know, I know the Arts Council is made up of a lot of people, so I just want to say thank you. But my last question to you would be, who holds the Arts Council accountable? And please don't tell me it's us as people to call you out. It's not our job to do that.
So whose is it? I mean, you're asking me the question. Maybe I thought that back.
You get funded by central government. What's the accountability that the central government goes?
Should I say those who are the government? So you want this government to hold us to account, because that would be the alternative. That we are responsible. We are funded by central government. Now, if we do not fulfil our charter, I think it is for the people to call us out, because if we wait for the government to call us out on equality, inclusion and diversity, there is going to be a deadening silence, perhaps. I don't know. But if that's what you want, then...
Well, it's not any worse than what's happening now, because no one's calling y'all out anyways, right?
They are though.
I mean, have you done a public town hall to go public? Because, you know, unless you're working in the organizations, do we go, there's a problem here. Most of the public are like, I just want to rock up and go to the concert. I just want to experience the artwork. You know, that it's kind of like asking us to call like the BBC phone line like they did over the weekend, right? Too much of this funeral happening.
Yeah.
You know, the public are not going to do that for art.
But here's the thing. I have recently, and when I say recently, it was in the last 12 months, went to events in which I spoke on behalf of the Arts Council, and I was not well received. No, I was not well received. People felt that as an arts school, and you know, 2 or 3 people in that event, I think if they could have got closer to me, I would have been, no, I'm exaggerating. But when you say it's not for the people and how do you do it, that is how you do it, because what happens then, I go back to my colleagues and say, this has happened, this is not good enough. We need to do something about this. And that's why and where the public will hold the Arts Council event. If you know that the Arts Council are coming to your town, to your event, go. And if you have an issue, call it out.
Sebak, is that enough for what Terry said about, would that be a way forward for small art organisation? Or is that, I mean, I was thinking about now that small art organisations are held into account. So already we're in situations where there's distrust between the artists and institutions. So how could we bring these forward to work it out? Or how art organisation could prevent it being going into a punitive mode?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something to be said about the fact that there is labour required in pointing this stuff out, right? It's not that, you know, you can take it lightly. It's something that you need to organise. You know, there's labour involved, and like I said, I would like to try and work out a way to put most of my time to, you know, as I've said in my vision, you know, radically transforming the cultural sector, but through the visual arts, like through supporting, creating systems of support for artistic production. So yeah, so I think there is a question about, I even quite like this town hall idea, actually. I mean, it would be fantastic, I think, if there would be, an opportunity, I don't know how often a year or if it's done in different regions, but an opportunity to say, okay, let's have our town hall meeting, and talk about some of the issues, because actually, I don't know if that conversation happens enough. And I think, and it's not about bringing down the Arts Council, but it is about actually thinking about, is the Arts Council fit for purpose for distributing large funds? I know they've changed it. I don't know when they changed from Arts Council of Great Britain to England, but just thinking about that question around how is that actually, how does that work, that system? Is it a centralised system? Who's actually involved? I think that question of who's involved in the decision making is a really important one. And so I feel as though that what's happening now is that we've got so heavily institutionalized and bureaucratized that we're actually losing the capability to have a dialogue. And it's, actually to have a conversation about what's actually going on. And if we can maybe think about those as also just as valuable spaces as the kind of policy making, because I understand your point, Teresa, of like thinking about, where can I make change, and is this, is curating the place, if it's not here, then where do I need to kind of be to actually make the kind of change I want to see? And I'm also, wondering, you sort of if you move further and further up the chain, does it become even more difficult to make those changes? So I suppose for the moment, I would say, I think for me, where I find solidarity is with other small scale organisations, if I'm honest, with artists, and I get called out by them because, and that's something I have to kind of, I feel, let's say that I have a responsibility to those relationships, and yeah, it's definitely the case. I don't get back to everyone on their emails. It's definitely the case that, however much you kind of want to do better, that there is a sense of sometimes that you feel like you're busying yourself. And I really would love, I mean, maybe it's also been too long in my trying to run an organisation from a domestic environment, but I'm really looking forward to kind of creating spaces, public spaces, where real dialogue and conversation can happen, because I think that's where possibility of change and being in relation and being in community, I think those things are the things I believe in, and I hope that's where I can take Innova to.
And Kai, can you fill into these, how, as an artist, how would you like to see that change?
Yeah, I would love to go to a town hall with meeting, and I also speak from being in academia, for better or for worse. No, but okay, I'll talk a little bit about. I'll talk maybe about. I really was very happy when I was delighted when Terry said that the system, the grant application system, is going to change. I mean, Grantium, there's been enough has been said about that and how not inclusive that is. And as a neurodivergent person, I've always thought that, don't queue up for NHS diagnostic tests, because that would take 6 months to 2-3 years. Just go on Grantium, and that's actually a pretty good measure of how disabled you are. Because that's free, and it's free of charge, right? So so I just don't want to add to that narrative. Enough has been recorded on Arts Professional and so on, but I really welcome that, because like what has been said, it is an investment, right? When you want to try to get grants, you have to invest time, you have to invest energy. It's not so straightforward. It's also an investment to call out on something. It's easier said than done. So much, most of us are precarious in the arts. It comes at a high cost. There's backlash. There's so many things to consider. You won't get booked, etc., etc., etc. If you are in a position to call something out. Yes, you must do that, but most people cannot afford to, and also you don't want to invest that energy. You don't also want that to be your public narrative, etc., etc. So it's not as simple as. So we do need mechanisms to be in place to help to ensure that it's not falling on the artists or it's not falling on individuals to have to do that kind of work. And also, like, I just want to do my work, right? I just want to do my bloody creative work. Okay, I can be a bad artist, but I just want to do my work. Simple as. And you hope that the system is taking care of itself, or there are things in place that frees you from having to devote those energies. We already are devoting so much energy to doing everything else except the actual thing that you're meant to do. That's kind of the definition of contemporary life somehow. It's like all the fun stuff, you're actually doing everything else that's not fun. So there's something inherently quite unhealthy in that. So in academia, just a big generalization. But I sit in a few, I am a reviewer for the Arts and Humanities Research Council and also the UKRI, UK Research and Innovation. And one of the things that is done is that we have this peer review college, peer review college, and it's people who are your peers who are reviewing as specialists your bits. And if we are talking about town hall, can we also extend those ideas to talk about having rotational? It's a bit like what's the word? When you go jury, right? Like you have to do that part as part of your citizenship. You have to contribute. So if that could help to decentralize the Arts Council England's job. And I was happy to hear from Terry, and I think he's gone. Very timely, good escape. But I was very happy to hear from Terry about how there are, I think I was happy, I guess, about how they're punitive. That sounds awful. I'm happy that there are punitive measures put into place about punishing institutions if they aren't doing the work that they claim to do, etc. But on the other hand, I also want to maybe just play devil's advocate. I come from Singapore. The Arts Council Singapore, it's called National Arts Council there, is not arm's length. It is government, it's state run, and it is doing also a lot of that kind of work, is doing policing work. And that is, there is the maybe danger of going to that maybe. So I just thought to flag that up. So maybe the kind of nice middle way is to have us more involved, paid, not for free, have artists involved, and also people from communities involved as part of that kind of peer reviewing processes, because it is the people's money, etc. So and also to maybe think about a more decolonized ontology, a more decolonized way of doing things. So not just trying to replicate a kind of a neo-capitalist system. So it's quite, I think it's been said not by other colleagues that it's a little bit weird that an arts council or a state, an arts council like Arts Council England and other similar outfits are actually run not creatively. They don't have creative ways of organizing. They don't have interesting creative ways of thinking about hierarchy, thinking about leadership, thinking about care and so on. So, but they are kind of trying to duplicate what corporate firms are doing, and so there's kind of a gap there. So could we, if we are thinking of other ways of doing things, think about a more decolonized way of doing things, decolonized ontology, other models, other modalities, co-op, etc. So think of setups that are maybe more agile and more inclusive. Yeah, something along those lines. And to your question, Wesley, about small organizations, and I actually think small organizations have the answer in that the lightness and agility allow them to try things out, because larger organizations often move very slowly, because there's so many processes, so many layers. So small organizations, and also online liminal organizations, collectives, etc., they could offer maybe alternative models, new kind of slippery models. But I also wanted to just point out, last point, but we always have excuses, right? We always say, oh, we can't do EDI, we're too small, we're too big, we're too, I don't know, it's too rainy, it's too whatever. We always have excuses. There's never a good day, there's never a good time to do EDI. So, yeah. And there's also COVID, by the way. Small matter of a global pandemic to stop us from doing EDI. So that's it, I guess.
Thank you, Kai. And Susan, have you got anything to add in terms of the EDI initiative, and especially the social communities that you are working with, and whether they have a different approach in tackling their own challenges?
Just a great conversation so far. It's hard to add to all of this, but I would go with the idea of the town hall, and I love the idea of the peer review. I mean, the problem that I have is the Arts Council just went through a huge reevaluation of its policy, and you know, Let's Create came out of that, but why was there no institutional inspection about how their processes work? They had a lot of time and they got a lot of input into that. I'm kind of surprised that there wasn't more evaluation of that. And unfortunately, they didn't take advantage of that. But I think the other model that, you know, to go with the kind of peer review, keeping it conversational, town hall approach is Terry. Isn't it amazing that we have Terry coming out and talking to everybody? It's unfortunate that he couldn't be here. So how about some more of that happening? Some more interactive stuff going on. You know, we've all been doing this for the past year, coming online and talking in groups. There's been a lot more of that.
Susan, you froze.
Oh dear, I froze. Sorry. Yeah, I was just making the point that I think there needs to be more conversational things going on with the Arts Council, and that they should be held account in that way. I guess the other thing was just about the holding account. It's an institution that asks all sorts of very small organizations to go through a lot of big effort, free effort to evaluate their programs. Why can't they do the same thing? You know, they're just not applying those sorts of things to their own procedures. I guess the only other thing I want to say is this is all very Arts Council, and you know, half of the organizations that I work with maybe aren't exactly arts organizations, but they're cultural organizations, and they feel they have no connection, or Arts Council money is not available to them. So why even bother? And also under the COVID regulations, a lot of people had felt that, you know, those programs were not for them. And so they didn't even bother applying. I mean, other than the labor that is involved in trying to do that. So I think the other point related to that is just, if we took a long view, and the people I'm working with are putting together an archive, and there was a huge amount of activity in the 1990s. And in the noughties, perhaps it was under New Labour, and they were putting more money into this kind of thing. But with austerity, is that all that's left, Arts Council? Is that the only way to support all of these small organizations in some way? And they do need support. It's all very well to say you're going to have grassroots, let's get out there and just do it, folks. you need money, and it has to come from somewhere. So yeah, that's my bit.
Well, if Terry is here, he can answer a little bit more about it, because obviously your point about whether there's funding and money available for those who are grassroots as well as those who are in social communities, and they're all written in the Let's Create strategy. But to what extent that it could be materialized is another aspect. And I think there's also some things about Kai's ideas about decolonizing institutions and using a more kind of decentralized approach to organize art organizations. And I think those are the things that is actually worth feedback to Arts Council. And Teresa got a very good point about accountability. So who is accountable? I mean, how to what extent that Arts Council is accountable for all these sort of setup. So I think these are sort of questions unanswered, and it is a surprise that we could not feedback or could not contribute to these Let's Create strategy before it has actually been released. So we don't really, well, we wait to see to what extent that it could really be materialized. But I'd also wonder, now that we have these strategies now that put in place for the 10 years, to what extent that you think that that could shape or change the landscape of the sector, of the arts industry? Would your stakeholders be changing in this approach? Who do you think that your stakeholders will be now? Teresa.
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, not that I'm an Arts Council funded, but I've worked in majority of the places I've worked in are Arts Council funded, and I kept thinking, like, how do you measure the change? What is the change we want to see? What is the goal, and who decided what that goal was? So if it's just every organization has to, if you're in London, you have to match your the population that's in London, right? Is it that black? Is it that black and white? Right? What is it? Because I think for me, my question is, it's like, so these principles were decided. Are those the principles that we should be working towards realistically? Who gets consulted on them, of course, but I often think it's like, well, what is it that we want to see? So I know, Kai, you're talking about like decolonial processes and cooperatives, and it's like, well, it doesn't work for everyone, right? I can't imagine an organization in the Cotswolds going like, we're going to decolonize. They're not, right? Because their way of being, their knowledge is completely different. So I have these kinds of, I hold two things in my head all the time. It's like radical practices and a love for institutional bureaucracy, right? This is where I meet myself. And I out myself. I love institutions. I love policy, but I love policy that can be embodied, right? And that's where my radical practice comes in. People are like, oh, so why that policy? I'm like, well, because this is how I hold it how I will hold you accountable. You signed up, you did your contract. Now, but I have to show you how to, because there are these expectations of behavior and culture change, right? Where a lot of people don't know what that means. These principles, he listed them, and I'm just like, inclusion to what? Inclusion for what? If I'm going to be included in the opera, I don't want to be there. That's okay. It's not, I don't want that. So I think there's deeper questions around like ethical practices and values that we don't all hold the same values, but the Arts Council wants us to. And that's the other thing of like, if you're a small arts organization, but you only really focus on one thing, and there is a value of you to focus on this one thing because of the community you serve, to some extent, why should you have to do it something differently? And I mean, that sounds a bit now extreme, almost a little bit right in that sense. But, I also have to ask myself these questions with smaller arts organizations. I mean, right now, I speak from a really different positionality because I'm at the Wellcome Collection, right? And it's a huge institution. There's actually 800 of us, but I work closely with 140. And I have a very different remit of how I do things and why I do things. So I can't even think in terms of like the difference of being inside a private charity versus being a publicly funded institution. It's so different, and the pressures are very different, and accountability is very different. So again, love of institutions and policies, and this radical practice, and thinking about, is it better for me to keep working inside private charities? Because you potentially can have space to have more radical practices than you can in the Arts Council sometimes. So yeah, I just wanted to add this question around accountability and policies, and and decolonizing too, and our expectations of both the institutions we work for, but also the things we can produce in the time that we're here, you know, because we all have limited time in most of our positions.
How is accountability carried out in a place like the Welcome Center? So who are you accountable to?
Ourselves. And the
so
charity.
Who is us? Who is us?
It's the employees, it's the board, it's a charity commission. So that's who we're accountable to. So we set our own agenda, and our agenda right now is around mental health, climate change, and vaccines. But there is also a commitment to diversity and inclusion. They're changing the terminology more to equity, but we set our own agenda internally, and that's what we have to kind of strategize towards and adhere to. And it's the programs that we put in place. But then even within an organization like that, you also have to ask the question of like, how can culturally people learn to hold other people accountable? And this is my biggest challenge around anti-racism and anti-ableism practices within an institution like that, or any institution, because people don't want to hold each other accountable. It's too scary.
And technically you don't have a public remit.
Nope, just our audiences.
Yeah.
I mean, Teresa may be in a very privileged position, and certainly some of the things that you did are really can be seen as good practice, but at the same time, it might not necessarily be able to materialize in other setting. And I wonder, I mean, what would be the challenge now is somewhere like in INIFA? I mean, knowing that there's quite a lot of expectation from these new scheme of Let's Create, and there are pros and cons, and we heard a lot of good things which Terry's told us about. But at the same time, to meet their criteria and to be able to fulfill the expectations is gigantic. So, I mean, to what extent that's pose a new challenge to INIFA?
I mean, I think that as I think Kai, I think you were saying about in terms of the scale of the institution. In terms of it being small, that there is this, this possibility of it being able to be nimble, and it's not maybe as slow as working with a larger number of people. But I still think that creating a culture of change within an organization actually can also still be quite a slow process, even if it's a small number of people, strangely. And sometimes, well, I know for sure, me coming in to the organization, there is this sort of definite fear around, oh, she's going to come in and she's going to want to change things. And it's like, for me, I think it's really important to recognize that institutions need to have a culture of change in order to sustain relevancy, because community changes, context changes, we found ourselves in varying, such a shift has happened, isn't it, over the last year? And so, like, of course you have to be adaptable. But I think one of the aims of the institution is to, reduce the amount that we kind of, because at the moment I would say a lot of what the program, because half of our funding comes from the Arts Council. So if we can't really sort of sadly, choose to say, well, Arts Council, that's your remit of what you think that we should be doing, but this is what we're going to be doing. And I think in some ways, I've been trying to think about how those mechanisms and tools can be mechanisms and tools for change. So, like, I did my first business plan the other day, and then I realized this is kind of like a score for how you want to sort of what you kind of want to sort of envision or make happen within the institution, and to think about how the budget supports you to do that. So like, not to see those things which are kind of being brought in or telling that we're told to do as tick box exercises, but really exercises that enable dialogue and conversation to happen. And then I think if in that process it really doesn't feel like a useful process, then maybe that's important, maybe to feed that back to Arts Council and say, so if I'm honest, if Terry was still here, I would say the creative case for diversity exercise, you know, I don't even want to call it hoop jumping or whatever. I don't personally feel as if I was being held accountable with the creative case for diversity, and I'm hoping that, you know, one of the investment principles, I mean, I guess obviously environmental collapse is a real thing, and you know, we do need to be thinking about those questions, but in relation, let's say, to this notion of inclusivity, is that what I put, inclusivity and relevance?
Inclusion and relevance.
Inclusion and relevance. Yeah, I would definitely agree with the notions of like, who is being included in what, like what are we being included in, and so what are we then being co-opted by in some ways. And again, I have to say, you know, I guess maybe because I've been doing a lot of research in women's groups from the 80s onwards, and how they've kind of affected change in health, education and housing, thinking about feminist strategies for like how to kind of lead an organization, I think is something I'm really trying to work out how to adopt, you know, as a way of kind of recognizing that the kind of accountability is something that should rest on everyone within the organization, and in some ways also with our audiences and with our funders. You know, we are all accountable to each other. So if that is the case, you know, how do we get into a culture of being able to sort of talk about these things? And I recognize very much from, you know, being in the States for like a year and then coming here and almost forgetting that you know, there is this kind of very weird way of talking about things in Britain, like that, you know, you're not supposed to sort of say things directly. You're sort of supposed to kind of go around, come back around again. And, you know, and I just, you know, that's not the culture that I come from. And so, and often when I am direct, I'm often told you know, that's quite maybe quite rude or whatever. So it's kind of, it's difficult to be, in some ways, I think, whoever you are truly culturally within institutions in Britain, because there are unwritten rules and ways of conducting ourselves. And I think we're all doing this thing of like, you know, trying to perform some version of ourselves. But I really truly feel that if we really want to make change, there has to be a kind of almost abolitionist approach to, and I'm surprised I'm even saying that, because I'm always believing in like, no, we can work within the damaged epistemes, you know, we can do repair, there's work to be done here, we can, but there might be at some point a point where we say, you know what, Arts Council England isn't working anymore, and we have to think of something else. And you know, maybe that's a bit of a, you know, a completely out there statement, but I just sort of think that, you know, we're trying all these different systems and we're trying to make it work. And, you know, I felt like I'd been away from London for about 10 years, and I came back and all the same people were pretty much in places of power. Like nothing had really shifted. And it's only really been in the last 2 to 3 years that I've started to see, you know, women of colour going in, getting sort of positions of power within cultural institutions. But I'm really saying in the last like 2 years, maybe 3 years tops. And, you know, that's, yeah, I mean, if you look at the number of women who are in, I mean, just, you know, as another area, if you look at the number of women who work in cultural organisations and the number of men who are directors, then, you know, there's a disparity. There's lots of disparities, right? And yeah, so, and there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I think one of the things, I mean, that's well said, Sylvas, thank you for it. And one of the things that I observe is also about you talking about this accountability, and also about the fact that we're basically, we're all in the same boat. Like, we have to unlearn and relearn a lot of things, and also thinking about a way forward, which doesn't necessarily mean that we could succeed. And in many ways, we learn more, and we're able to go over to look at what is the best approach by making a lot of mistakes. Now, that kind of being made accountable for could be, I could actually see some sort of danger as of how organization could try not to fail in order to secure the funding. Because then if you make a lot of mistakes or make a bad mouth of yourself, then how are you going to survive? And that could be a potential danger of what is really created. So there is something good in a way that, well, we should all be accountable. Everyone in the organisation should be accountable for, including Arts Council. But at the end of the day, what sort of space are we allowed us to make a trial, to try and error? I think that is somewhere that we are in the situation. All of us are in that situation, because, I mean, Kai very early on talking about this lack of leadership. I totally agree with that. But at the same time, we may not necessarily have a leader who could answer all the questions.
No, but it's not about that. But it is about the will. There's no political will by so many institutions. I don't mind that people try and fail. Like you said, we are all learning and unlearning. That's part of the process. But if there isn't any will, there are loads of institutions that seem to just still be they don't clock it. They don't genuinely clock it. They're doing it because you have to put up a black square. Okay, we'll do it. Yeah, we'll do it. We'll put out a statement of solidarity. Yeah, we'll do it. Do they mean it? No. So there isn't that will. So if there is that kind of commitment, like, okay, yeah, we know that something needs to be done. Yeah, we want to. We're genuine. We want to learn. We admit that we want to. We don't mind this process of learning and fragility and this like negotiation, etc. Then yeah, of course. I mean that's growth, right? That's nurturing, and that's yeah, you're learning from one another, and you're listening. You're doing a lot of listening, but I don't know if there even is that willingness. I don't know if there is.
Can I just add something? I think there's willingness, but I think a lot of people just don't know how to. And I think there's actually fundamentally an understanding of an ethical practice by lots of people in leadership roles right now. Because you have to imagine that right now, so the people that are in leadership roles, some of them are the ones who may have done like amazing curating at the point where the professionalization of the arts occurred. These are the people in their 40s, mid-40s to 50s, right? But if you imagine that the people in the 50s, they didn't enter administration the way that the people in their 40s and 30s did into the art world, right? So in terms of understanding, a lot of people were educated in how to run institutions now. That's arts management, curatorial, we know there's lots of MAs, PhDs, we know this. So, but for me, there is something fundamentally around a lack of understanding what it means to lead an institution or direct an institution. There is a lack of clarity of code of ethics, right? Why are you going to do what you're going to do, and how are you going to do it, and with whom? What's the reason, right? Anybody can set up a charity. You put out your mission, but really, what are your ethics behind it? Because I think it's about, there's a misunderstanding, and I think like the will, I think lots of people are willing to, but they don't actually have a real understanding of what are the ethics by which they practice. So Sapaka, you were talking about feminist kind of, shall we say, practices and how you institute, right? So we're all instituting constantly. And so for me, it's like, yeah, but that's ethics. that's part of your ethical practice, is to practice in a different way. And I think a lot of our institutions replicate colonial administration and systemic oppression, no matter what. So we are stuck here, guys. All of us, I wouldn't say guys, I shouldn't say guys, y'all, we are all stuck here. This is it for the next maybe 100 years. We're stuck with the colonial administration to deal with. And it's always going to be oppressive to a group. But what can some of us do when we're inside of it? That's what I'm more interested in. Because the thing is that I get paid to sit inside the institution. And that for me is liberating, right? I've got a space, I've been given a space. They say do X, Y, and Z. And all I can do is push and ask questions, right? Why are we not doing this way? Why are we still doing that? And I think more of us need to get inside the systems and challenge it from the inside. And not everyone is built to do that either, right? Because there's an expectation, especially of brown and black bodies, to do the work. Well, what about the white people who are supposed to be doing the work in a different way, and maybe in a more hardcore way? But I think there is a, you know, Sapaka, you're here, Kai, you're here, it's Weesie and me. We're all women of color, except for Susan. You know, it's sort of like, it would have been great if we had some more white people here to talk about it, because that is actually part of the bigger conversation too. So anyways, I would say you should do a follow-up with an all-white panel who are directors to talk about some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
I think dialogue is absolutely important, and we don't hear enough of it. And you're so right that, I mean, so much of those groundwork were actually gone down to black, white, yellow to do the runner, and we don't really have that enough for the organisation. So, and I know that Susan trying to say something, so I kind of go back to our only white person in the panel. Susan may have something to add, please.
As the only white person. No, I absolutely agree, Teresa, about where can you affect change? And speaking as a white person, the place where I feel I can affect change is in the institution that I'm involved in. So I'm involved in the university. How can I make the changes that are needed there and challenge those, you know, performative statements that they made back in July, and keep challenging. And I think the onus is on the white people to do the challenging, as opposed to calling on the people of color to have to take the burden. That's certainly my agenda, is to talk to the white people and say, look, it's up to you. You've got to make the change in this institution. Where can you make change? In the institution that you sit in. I mean, where else are we going to do it? It's got to be there. But also in those small institutions that you're involved in as a volunteer or as a family member, you know, your family, that's where you make the change. Those are the institutions that you are involved in. You got to work there.
We are coming, I'm looking at the time, and I want to go shortly afterwards to the Q&A, and I know that some of the audience are still with us all the way. I hope that there are some burning questions on the floor. But before I give it to the floor, I wanted to ask, well, we raised a lot of issues, and precisely the point about today's discussion is not to resolve the problem, but to raise a lot of questions. So we did raise a lot of it, and which is great. We need to recognize it. We need to have that awareness before we can move forward. But I wonder whether any of you have come across any good practice that we can share, even though we kind of come across loads and loads of challenges that, well, for a lot of food for thought. But what can we move forward? I mean, what could we do? Esteban, going back to you.
So I was going to talk about the naming of things, actually. And the significance of that, because there was a cultural institution in Rotterdam called Witte de Wit, and it was on Witte de Wittestraat in Rotterdam, and there was a program, I think it was probably about 2 or 3 years ago, that was very much, it was an element, I suppose, in some ways, of inviting black and brown people into the institution to talk about various kinds of social politics in some ways in relation to a visual art project. And this question was raised about how can we be having this conversation in a place which is named after, a trader. How can we have some, this kind of involvement? How can we have that close proximity? And I think from there ensued a kind of series of conversations, which I think is really important for an institution to reflect on, that the programming that they do shouldn't just be about another event, but it should be really also a space in which they can reflect on themselves as an institution and the communities that they serve. Through community consultation, I think they've just recently renamed the institution. Now it's, I think, Kunst Institut Melli, which is named after an artwork by Ken Lum, which is on the outside of the building. So I don't know what's actually happening inside the building, but I think for me there was something quite interesting there in terms of being called out by the very community that you think you're serving or bringing in, or so there's something about the kind of ongoing dialogue and what do you actually do with that, and how does it affect something to happen within the institution. And I think the other model I was just also thinking about was I think it was 2015, 2016 when sorry, I'm just forgetting now totally the name of this campaign, but it was a group of architecture students who were calling out a public monument again to someone who'd been heavily involved in policies that do not reflect their politics today. And there were a series of protests and demonstrations, but I think what happened also as a result of that was creating a smaller group within the academy to actually investigate and think through decolonizing methods and how they can be implemented within the infrastructure of the school. Because I often think about these activities and groups happening outside of institutions, right? And but actually, increasingly, I need to kind of also think about how change can be enacted inside institutions, and to think about the open invitation. And it might be scary actually to sort of open up that space and say, okay, we would like to talk about the direction of this institution and whether we are really serving you as a community, because sometimes the answer could be like, no, you're not. And this is what we'd like you to do. And so I think there is this element of also it happening in, I always say about this thing about in relation or in community, or it's a dialogic exchange. So it's not just that the community says you should be doing this and you go ahead and do it. It is also about that relationship that you build and allows for that change to happen. And I think those are the models that I think I'm looking to, which is like, okay, after you've sort of said, look, this isn't working, how do you then embed a kind of system or mechanism within your institution that allows you to stay relevant and in dialogue?
Good, thank you. And Teresa, you must have a lot of good practice to share.
I don't believe in anything called good practice, because I think all practice is going to fail, and it's a iterative. It's got to shift and change constantly, because if not, you replicate a system you institute that is actually exclusionary at some point. So I don't have examples of I would call a good practice or what I look to. For me personally, I just try to experiment quite a lot and pilot and think of cross sector. So I try not to look at the arts most of the time. I always try to look outside of what is happening, and I look at sociology quite a lot, just in terms of what are they exploring, who could I go to, how are they thinking, how are they doing things, because you can apply it to the way we behave. So I'm really interested in, of course I've said this, behavioral change. It's not my job. Often I think what you do after 6 o'clock, it's up to you, but if you're working within the institution that I'm currently practicing in, I'm there to affect change. but I can't affect change unless the people I'm working with, which are my colleagues, understand what it is, right? So we have a very specific mandate, which is around deaf, disabled, neurodivergent, and racially minoritized communities. This is who we want to work, include, center. We have to think about, embedding, especially these 4 groups. People have asked why, and it's because they are the most marginalized groups in the art sector and the culture sector. So I think when I went there, the assumption was I was going to have solutions. So one of the things is that I often find is everyone has solutions. Everyone has an idea of how they're going to do this. I don't have solutions. I have lots of questions. So for me was, how do you find out how an organization like the Welcome, where a majority of people are university educated, of course it's 87% white, well-meaning, well-intentioned, good people, university educated. Why are we still so exclusively white, non-disabled, and middle class? Why? So the question is, ask the staff, why do they still keep employing with why do they create these conditions? And, people often say, well, we don't talk about certain things, so I don't know. So for me, it was about you have to go back to the staff themselves. So it's got to be internal, and ask them what they need in order to start thinking about how you design for them. So I'm really interested in this idea of, it's what they do in product design, which is called person-centered design. So I did a piece of research called person-centered design for inclusive practices, where we took 10% of our staff to actually ask the questions over 4 months. It was a big piece of research. We've got the results, we did lots of surveying, and what we came to find out is that no one wants to talk about race, right? And I was like, okay, of course I know that. So a lot of the stuff I knew, but I needed the evidence. I didn't want to presume, because I think it's really a problem when we presume what's needed, because I didn't know. So out of that, there's other pieces of work I did, but we did something where we basically had race conversations with colleagues that were mixed. So we took whole teams. I took a whole team, and it happened. I had started the planning in March, and of course then last year, and then we had the anti-racism protests globally. So it kind of slotted right into this period. And because we had found out no one wanted to talk about race, so let's put it on the table. And what it does is it takes a lot of emotional labor, right? But I have lots of space, so I don't mind putting myself at the center of the stuff and going, let's talk about it. So I think there is something about how the people on the inside who are paid to do this work do it, and do it in a way that's almost not ethical, but in a caring way. So a lot of the practices that I do around are care practices. I think my title should be care practitioner, because that's what I do a lot of, is take care of the people through these conversations. So long story short, what I'm currently working on is designing a social justice curriculum for the Welcome Collection. So last year they did a statement in June or July, and I asked them to ensure that we didn't put an action plan or make any commitments. I said, because once you start saying I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, you're likely to fail. So why don't we leave it open? But I had already had an idea that we were going to do an anti-racism curriculum, and we decided we would do a social justice curriculum that looks at anti-ableism and also anti-racism. So what it really does is, if we are going to be trying to embed these practices, people have to learn how to. So it's a year-long, well, it's not just year-long, it'll keep going, program where I'm co-designing. I'm not designing, I'm more holding the space, the framework. I'm working with external people, so a sociologist, an anti-eugenicist, and a anti-racism educator, but she's also doing a PhD. And then we're working with 2 disability critical studies people who will actually design for us. These are people who are both living it, doing it, and writing about it, because I can only hold certain space. So for me, it's about how can I invite our colleagues to think about their positionality, which we often don't. We give people half a day's thing, then they go, half a day's workshop, and you're done. Unconscious bias training, you're done. It's not true. As I like to say, it's lifelong. It's a lifelong practice. Every day I wake up thinking around race and disability. I do, because this is part of our world. And how can I not convince my colleagues, but how can I remind them that they are just as accountable to creating the conditions we work in. It's all of us or no one. And I think there is something about that. So, and what I'm hoping to do is with this curriculum is eventually give it away. That's my goal. So we have the funding to spend on it and bring people in and evaluate it, is how can other cultural organizations also benefit from it? So maybe in a year's time, you'll see it somewhere publicly and I'll happily give it away. Of course, everybody will be critical of it. That's what I expect, because there's no one right way to do it either. And, you know, whether anti-racism and anti-ableism should be the thing that we should focus on, that's another set of questions. But that's what I'm trying to do at the Welcome currently. Great,
yeah. I would definitely sign up to your giveaway. Please put me on your list the first. And Kai, do you have something you add in your area?
Yeah, you were asking about examples of good practice.
Yeah, or practices.
I'm happy to find one good practice. I have a list of bad practices, but we won't go through them today. But I think I would like to see more celebration, not just emphasis on trauma. So more celebration and more embedding of nice ways of doing things. I also want to see the panels like these, not just when we're talking about EDI, and not just when we are, oh, we need to talk about inclusivity, therefore let's have these guys. No, we should be invited to everything. So yeah, so it's good that there are these panels, and it's shocking how long it's taking, but yeah, good. Let's keep going, and we want to be everywhere. Yeah, I don't know. Will there be a day where we have more non-hierarchical setups, where the person looking after an artwork in a building is paid the same as the director? As I don't know. Will we have a day where there isn't that kind of separation, where we're not looking at people who don't look like us? Today's Guardian has 2 reports that just makes you want to go to bed in depression, not and also because you're tired. What was it? So one was saying how during COVID, most nepotism has gone higher. So you employ people who look like you, who are from your family network, who know you. The other report was about Channel 4 removing the 2 people of color from the board, I think. So and you just feel, for people who are not British, who have chosen to be here voluntarily, it's like, why would you do that? No, yeah, I volunteered to be here. And you ask yourself, what am I doing here? What's going on? Why are we moving backwards? And each time you make a little bit of progress, and then you move a few steps back. And then the other day I was doing a workshop, and I was told, and it was interestingly a decolonization workshop, and then I was told, actually we need to realize that it is a white-run society. And oh, okay, did you just say that to me? And why are you asking me to do this workshop? So there are always steps back, and then but you try to kind of be focused and think, yeah, okay, the people like you who are also helping to push things, and who are trying to yeah, get things going. So in terms of good practice, yeah, this is an example of good practice, I suppose, in terms of pointing things out, in terms of pointing out what's wrong, and also hopefully the people in the room aren't just people who are converted. People in the room are people who want to learn more and try to also do. There are also lots of people in the room who are also doing similar work, but oftentimes we are talking to people who already are bought on the issue. They share the same or similar ideas. So we need to try to reach out to people who aren't coming to these spaces to talk about these issues. And that's a longer term project, like what Teresa was saying, 100 years, yeah, give or take. That's why I'm in education. Very noble, I know, but that's why we do what we do, because it won't change overnight. We keep doing it, and then the next generation keep doing it, and it keep doing it, iterative, generative. So yeah.
Thank you, Kai. Persistent and enduring. Definitely, it is
Stubbornness,
a long way to go.
stubbornness, and stubbornness. Just trying not to give up.
Right. So, Susan, I mean, I did remember that. I don't remember, it was the last conversation we were discussing the panel, and then you were telling me that, oh, do not present me first. Do not ask me to speak first. I'm too white to be in the panel.
I'm a white lady.
So I'm asking you the last now,
you know,
and please also help us to conclude today's discussion.
I can't possibly do that. But I would ask, is everybody on this panel not born in the UK?
Including you, yeah.
Including me?
Yes. Yes.
What?
No, I was born here, but.
Oh, I thought you said you were American or something. No.
Oh no, I was in America for a year, but I wasn't born there.
You're the Brit then. Okay.
Right. Or maybe Terry could be a Brit as well.
Yeah.
I have to say I'm a British citizen now, though, so I'm committed to this place. So I'm not.
I'm not a British citizen. Theresa May, no, not Theresa May's fault. Other issues.
Yeah.
I guess I just wanted to, for my good practice, Teresa, I really want to have a copy of whatever you're doing, but I'm wondering about, in your development of that, I would think it's the process of building that curriculum where you're going to affect some change. Like it isn't just going to be you developing it, right? It's going to be people within the organization and having them sitting down and thinking about it. So it's in that process, as opposed to just the curriculum itself, that you'll be making some changes, because people will be thinking about all of the things that you're trying to do. The other thing I just wanted to point out was again, in the university, trying to sort of change the way things are done there. We've been using a session called Safe and Brave. It comes out of theater, where at the beginning of each term, each semester, the students go through a Safe and Brave session to try and think about their own positionality and subjectivity in relation to all the other people in the class. But we also applied this then in our big staff meeting, and developed a Safe and Brave process where the staff would have to do this. We'd love to be able to apply this then to the executive, have them thinking about what's their positionality in relation to each other and other people who have less power than themselves, and
surprising they're not the first group to do it. They're meant to be the last one.
Yeah, maybe. I guess that's all I wanted to say. Other than that, I would urge you to look at, because we don't have chat here, do we? I'd put the website. Look at Eclipse Theatre and the report that Slate put together. I think it's a really good example of good practice, grassroots practice of their enablers on the ground, coming up with some really good ideas for people involved in theatre and the arts in general.
Great, thank you, Susan. And that is just the right time to open up for some questions. I know that there's still quite a few audience are staying with us, and I wonder whether anybody would have a question they want to, perhaps not necessarily a question if you don't have one, but even if you want to share comments or sharing your own experience with us, please do speak up. Yes. I would not know who is this. That's just one person. Oh, it's Anna. Anna came. Yes, hi, Anna.
Hi, Wesley, and hello, Kai, who used to be a colleague of mine. It's so good to see you. Just a few quick comments. I mean, I wish we could just I would like to go out with you for a long time. I've just been in discussions of the race equity strategy for my university. So this is such a, I can't tell you how refreshing this is as a point of difference. I'm just going to say 3 different things that relate to 3 different strands and maybe bring a bit of a different perspective about the Arts Council. And I think this speaks to what Teresa was saying about whether you stay in and make change within institutions or you agitate from without. And I think this is something that a lot of us struggle with. You know, you have to think that an organization like the Arts Council, as Terry said, it's in such close proximity to the government, right? That it can only be a certain way, in a certain sense. It can only be in relation to that body. So the idea that it could somehow be creative, agile, agitating, you just have to recognize that a body like that is reporting to the government. So it is very constrained in that way. And I think, you know, that's the case with many institutions that are in relation to, you know, oppressive structures. And so, you know, to me, that's the benefit of being outside of the institution in a place like Innova, although, as you say, you have to take that money, you have to report, you have to do all of this sort of recording and bureaucracy that takes you away from the actual work that you'd like to do, right? And it actually shapes it. So that's one thing to think about. The question of will, I think, is really interesting. I think we probably have all different experiences of what's going on right now around these initiatives. I think I'm more concerned at this idea that people can just fix things. You know, that what we're talking about are long histories of violence and structural violence, trauma that can't easily be fixed. So I guess more what I see is this idea that, well, we're just, you know, we're going to do this and this and this, and this is going to fix this. We're just kind of reshuffle the deck, have a little bit more color in it. I think I see more of that kind of attitude, and at the extreme, and this really hasn't been raised because so much has already been, but there's kind of a danger of a fetishization of racial difference, I see. I mean, you can already see it in the world of fashion and, you know, the media, just the fetishization of the Black body or the mixed race woman or the Asian woman. And I think, you know, this kind of objectification about, you know, well, can we get a Black person who's also trans, and can we get an Asian person who's disabled? You know, that will really, you know, that will make the deck really strong. Yeah, I'm more concerned about that, you know, sort of the way that this then goes off the rails towards other kinds of oppression. So yeah, I think it's not an easy situation, and it brings up, it does bring up a lot of labor, as you say, Sapaka. I mean, it brings up all of those histories of, all of those heavy histories, and what responsibility we bear to make a difference. That's why these conversations are so important, and I really appreciate them. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. That's really useful. I think, well, I totally echo with you that we're in the same institution, and just having these race equity strategy coming out, and these conversations is just so timely, so much that we needed. I'm not going to say a lot because I also know there's another hand raising. Is it Rudenard?
Rudy Hart.
Rudy Hart, yes.
Yeah. I wanted to go to, I hope I'm pronouncing names right, Specker, when you're talking about with the wits, like, I think that's the whole point, like, Rotterdam kind of, in many ways, misses the mark and really has an issue with engagement in its local, like with its local community. There's a very big separation between its grassroots and its institutions. Like, I feel like there is, particularly up north in the UK, that you really do. I think there are a lot of like similarities to be pulled against with like the way in which London works and Amsterdam works compared to, say, Rotterdam and Manchester. And also what Teresa was saying about people going through education and then going into the arts, like through doing PhDs and curating and stuff. I, as an art student, got very little education on my course on like how and which to navigate things. So whilst I understand what you're saying, that there's more chances that people could maybe go and find education about stuff, I still think that, like, especially if the, like, I mean, class system is even bigger, like that issue, that it's still very, very, very hard to get an education in how to apply for funding and things like that. And understanding that, like, say if you are going for funding for money, you should also take time out of, you should cast the time that you're taking to write those write for funding as money time, because it is effort, it is work and things like that. Just all those little things like aren't really taught, even though you are going on a course which you're hoping to do a career and make a career out of. And it's then not, and then also like this idea of maybe if you're from like an ethnic minority or marginalized, or like coming from disability backgrounds, how many universities have networking ways in with local authorities to help young people of like autistic or special needs backgrounds who can't make it through normal education programs or systems, like, and going back to what people were saying about how it's performative and accountability, how many government-led organisations by councils take the money and say that they're helping people from disabled backgrounds, like go like saying that they're helping them get into the arts, and really they're not. They're just like putting them off for a few months, you know, not really taking into account how good their talent is. And really, like, you know, art schools don't, from what I've seen, don't like build workshops or studio spaces around being like helpful to disabled young people. You're trying to cram 100 students in a year. Like, that's sensory overload for many people who are autistic or Aspergic or on the spectrum. These are just not, it's just not possible. And yeah, that's kind of like what I've taken from the talk.
Yeah.
Thank you,
for
all
your
of you.
comment. Yeah, I wonder whether Kai could respond a bit to it, because I know that you're setting up a new MA in art leadership, and I was just thinking whether you also kind of think about these other inclusive issues that Rudenart was mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's working with people like Rudy that have taught me a lot, and also give me hope and make me want to wake up from my bed again after reading the depressing articles. So working with people like Rudy, we've worked, I've known Rudy from before the session. make me think about inclusivity in all ways. So it's not just about one thing, it is about the intersectionality, it is about class, it's about everything. And that's something I'm thinking about in the master's program that I'm working on. It is trying to, so it is a master's program, it's next year and it's on leadership, but it is also precisely unpacking the term leadership and to reclaim what leadership could be. So we are looking at not just existing models of power, but we're also examining what so-called power is, what leadership is, what distribution and redistribution of power might look like. So unpacking it and to elevate and to create new pipelines of people who wouldn't have had their foot through the door, who wouldn't have thought of themselves as leaders, who wouldn't think that, you know, this is for me, and to kind of create, open the door for other people, all kinds of different people from different backgrounds. And the arts is so exclusively elitist, which also make us so blind to our own issues. We think we're so liberal. we think we're so progressive. We think we're so I come from London, so we do the double kissing thing even at the Slade, which is where I was educated. So we're so liberated. We're so nice. We're not, and that's exactly why we also have a lot of these issues that we don't want to address, and we don't hold ourselves accountable. Yeah, I'm drifting.
Okay, I'm also looking at the time. I know that we are already 6 minutes past, so it's almost the time to close. So I want to thank all the speakers and also the audience staying with us all the way for making this discussion so stimulating. And we have lots of dialogues and food for thoughts now generated from these panel. And this is only the beginning to address sectoral challenges for art institutions. And we do hope that more dialogue could be held in future occasions, and certainly a lot more dialogue with a mixed group of people, not just colour. So I think that would be our next goal. We're coming to a close now, but before we let you go, we'd also like to remind you our next event at Creature is Monuments and Democracy, a paradox or fruitful combo by Tanya Shitnich, as part of Performance, Monuments and Public Spaces research series. It is on Thursday, the 22nd of April, 1 to 2 p.m. You can find the registration link on Creature website, and we hope to see you there. So once again, thank you to all the speakers for such an insightful discussion and the audience participation. So goodbye for now, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the panel. Around